A cold wind swept down the dusty main street of a small western town, its sharp whistle echoing between the wooden storefronts where townsfolk carried on with their ordinary lives, unaware that something extraordinary was about to unfold before their eyes. At the far end of the street near the general store, a woman stumbled out of the saloon, her dress torn at the sleeve, her bonnet fallen into the mud, her face pale as if shame itself had grabbed her by the throat and dragged her into the open daylight. And as she clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders, trying to hide the bruises of both pride and body, a group of men jeered from the porch, their laughter cruel, their words sharper than any whip, and the townspeople turned their heads, whispering but refusing to step forward. For fear and gossip always walked hand in hand, she staggered forward, her knees weak until one man, red-faced and mean-eyed, shoved her hard enough that she crumpled in the street, the dust rising around her like a cruel curtain closing on a play she never agreed to star in. And there she lay broken, not just by the fall but by the silence of everyone around her, silence that shouted louder than any insult, silence that told her she was unworthy of defense. But then from down the street came the steady sound of boots striking against the hard-packed ground, slow, deliberate, echoing with the weight of authority and defiance. And as the crowd's murmurs hushed, they turned to see a tall cowboy making his way through the growing tension, his broad shoulders cutting a striking figure against the orange glow of late afternoon, his hat casting a shadow that made his eyes unreadable yet unflinching, his long duster coat brushing against his spurred boots, and slung at his hip was a revolver that gleamed like a promise that justice was never too far gone. He didn't rush, he didn't hesitate. He simply walked with the kind of calm that only men who had faced storms and survived could carry. And when he reached the woman lying in the dirt, he stopped, crouched low, and gently slid his arms beneath her fragile body, lifting her as though she weighed no more than a whisper. His strength not harsh but protective, the kind of strength that told her she was safe for the first time in too long. And the gasps from the crowd rolled like thunder as he straightened, holding her close against his chest, her tear-stained cheek pressed to the fabric of his shirt, her heart thudding with both fear and relief, because for the first time, someone had chosen to carry her instead of casting her aside. The men on the porch sneered, one spitting tobacco into the dirt, muttering about meddling cowboys. But when the tall stranger's eyes rose to meet theirs, the weight of his gaze was like a shot fired in silence. It dared them to move, to speak, to so much as breathe wrong, and not one of them did, because behind those steady eyes lived a man who feared nothing, not even the judgment of an entire town, for right was right and wrong was wrong, and in his heart he knew that if good men stayed silent, cruelty would always win. He carried her down the street slowly, deliberately, each step echoing louder than the last, and the people who once turned away now parted, not in shame for her but in awe of him, as though his courage had cracked the mirror of their own cowardice. And in that moment they began to see her differently, not as a fallen woman, not as someone to be mocked, but as a soul worth saving, worth defending, worth being treated with the dignity that had been stolen from her. She clutched the fabric of his shirt tighter, whispering through trembling lips that he didn't have to help her, that he didn't know her shame, that she wasn't worth his trouble. But he lowered his head, just enough to murmur back that no woman alive deserved to be left in the dirt, no matter what the world whispered, and that he had more room in his arms for her dignity than any of those cowards had in their hearts for decency. His voice carried like a promise, low but steady, the kind of voice that could still the panic in a storm. And though her tears still fell, they no longer felt like tears of defeat, but like the washing away of something she'd carried too long. He took her past the church, past the stairs of women clutching their children closer, past the blacksmith who set down his hammer mid-swing, past the sheriff who stood with his hand resting nervously on his belt but said nothing. Because even lawmen knew that sometimes true justice wasn't written in the books, but in the actions of one brave soul who refused to bow. When they reached the edge of town, the cowboy shifted her carefully in his arms, his jaw set, his stride unbroken, and he told her softly that shame had no claim on her now, that every step they took was a step away from the cruelty that tried to own her. And as the town faded behind them, the sky opened wide with streaks of crimson and gold, like heaven itself was painting a new beginning. She lifted her head just enough to look at him fully for the first time, and though the dust clung to his boots and the lines of hardship marked his face, she saw in him something she hadn't believed in for years: honor, unyielding and unashamed. and it breathed into her a courage she thought she'd lost forever. For miles he carried her, never once loosening his hold, never once making her feel like a burden, until at last they came to a quiet stretch of land where the river sang softly to the grass, and there he set her down gently on a rock by the water's edge, kneeling before her so his eyes met hers without judgment, and he told her she could rebuild, that life wasn't about the bruises of yesterday, but about the strength to stand tomorrow. And though she tried to protest again, telling him she had nothing left, his answer was simple. He told her that sometimes all a person needed was someone to believe in them. And he believed in her with all the weight of his word, because he had carried her from shame into a chance at freedom. The stars blinked awake above them as night slowly drew its curtain, and as she leaned into his steady presence, she realized that this cowboy wasn't just a stranger. He was the living proof that kindness could still exist in a world that thrived on cruelty, and that even in the loneliest of nights, there was always someone willing to fight for light. The tale of that day would be whispered in town for years, how a woman struck down in the street was lifted by a cowboy's arms, and how in that one act of courage, he didn't just save her, he reminded everyone watching what it meant to be truly human, to choose compassion over cowardice, to carry dignity where shame once tried to dwell. And though she didn't know what the future held, she knew one thing with certainty. She would never again let shame define her, because a cowboy had carried her away from it, and in doing so, he had carried her into a life worth living. And dear viewers, if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that courage, compassion, and hope still matter in this world, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because every story we share here is meant to inspire, to heal, and to remind us that no matter how broken the world may seem, there will always be someone brave enough to carry us forward. So join us, stay with us, and let's keep these powerful stories alive together.